The title of this training is The Inherent Strengths in Kinship Families. Legacies. And I have 3 objectives. One, first, like to describe and give you a definition of legacies and why legacies are strong and are a strength in kinship families. The second is to explain how to use legacies. And by the way, everything when I use the words use, I'm not really teaching you how to use. It's if anything, all I'm doing is kind of providing a framework for what you do instinctively. Okay? Providing a structure for what you do instinctively. Because if you've noticed in a lot of the questions, people are doing this already, but here is like the why and the how behind it. And then the third thing I'm going to do, which to me is the most powerful thing, is to talk about how you as relative caregivers, and this is your strength, you can create new legacies in your families, new traditions, new values in your families. You can disrupt the legacies. And by disrupt legacies and cycles, I'm talking about disrupt and prevent the reasons that resulted in the children coming into your care. How can you do that? What do you need to do in order for that to happen? So how do you create new legacies, new patterns of behaviors, and then how you can use your strength to create and disrupt old patterns in the family? So let's talk about legacies and start with the definition. Legacies are traditions passed down or inherited from one generation to the next. And this was the best definition that I found, because were a lot longer. But it's the idea of traditions, of history. You can also put with tradition, history that's passed down or inherited. Key word here is inherited. By birth and because you are family, it's your tradition, it's your past, it's your history. You may not want it to be your history. You may reject it, but you've inherited by birth, by family, by being a member of this family. And it's passed from one generation to the next through storytelling, through the written word as well as the verbal word. Now, here's my question to you. What do legacies do for you and give you? If you could just put that in the chat that answer out for me. What do legacies give you and do for you? What do those traditions, what do those histories about your family, about your past, give you and provide for you? What does it do for you and give you? So if anybody could just chat, and Candy, if you could just kind of give back what people are saying.
Okay, we've got some of them flowing in here. Belonging.
All right.
Pride.
Mm-hmm.
Sense of identity.
Okay.
Keeps us connected to our roots. Provides memories and inspiration.
Nice.
A sense of connection.
Mm-hmm.
Connections to family, pride and heritage, expectations.
Okay. All right. Excellent. These are the strengths. You just listed the strengths of legacies in kinship care. You just listed what are the positives in kinship care. And I'm even going to go so far as to say, what are some of the strengths in kinship care that aren't available? And what are some of the advantages in kinship care that aren't available in foster and adoptive families? I'm going to start with that word. Someone said sharing, a sense of belonging, a sense of sharing. I'll be specific. Foster parents and adoptive parents cannot use words like we have relatives who did X, Y, and Z. They can't use words like our family has a history of. They can't use words like us. Together as a family, we can do things. So those words like we, our, and us, they can't use because they do not share that legacy with you. They have their own legacy, but they don't share that biological legacy with you. They don't share that extended family legacy with you. They don't share that connection. And that's one thing that's a plus, that's an advantage in kinship care, is that you share the history with that child. When we worked with children that were going into adoption, we spent, again, days and hours and weeks and months before we even got them moved into the home, where they had to create a history that they could say they shared. And the history might be things like, what were the movies that they enjoyed? They had to discover things of interest. They had to discover activities, create activities and events, both social and recreational. Okay. They had to create activities with the children so that they could refer to shared experiences that they could build on that would lead into connections. You already have the foundation. They had to create the foundation. And these are histories that you shared with them, not as their aunt or uncle, but as individuals. This history was actually your history that you're now sharing with the children. That's a plus. That's a strength. Those words of ours and mine and we and ours, having a history that's already there before they even come into your home, that makes you feel belonging and connection. That's what exists in kinship care that does not exist in foster and adoptive families. And that's your strength. So sharing the history, having a common beginning, a common foundation, that's your strength. And then you also are the library for the information. Foster parents and adoptive parents are not the library. They have to look it up. They have to be told. They have to research. You're the library because someone has already told you. You have the memories, you store it. And then you have the access. You're the linkage to the past for the children through the stories. Foster parents and adoptive parents, by not having the stories, by not being the library, they have nothing to link to. They have to discover it themselves. They have to discover the past themselves. And don't get me wrong, that in and of itself is an attachment process, which is a strength for adoptive and foster families. Because again, it's building and sharing the history that became their goal. While with yours, it wasn't building or building the history or discovering the history. It was sharing the history and being the linkages to the history. That's your strength. Now, this I think is very interesting. I think a lot of relative caregivers take for granted that you are the living history for many of the children. To be able to look at you and to know you were the first one who went into the service. You were the first one who was a homeowner. You were the first one that started your own business. You were the first one to go to college. You were the first one to graduate high school. Being the first, or being part of the history. I came from sharecroppers. I was involved with families where my dad was a doctor, or where my family were sharecroppers, where they marched in certain kinds of activities, where they were activists in the communities, where you were the history. Telling stories about yourself is telling stories about living history. And relative caregivers don't seem to understand or appreciate the value of stories about yourself are stories about history. And being able to talk about what you've done is being able to describe yourself as a living history. And what's so interesting between being a contact, being a source of history, being a linkage to the past, it motivates the kids to want to pursue a relationship with you, of wanting to pursue an attachment with you. Motivates them to want to be around, even if it's to just hear the stories. Now, I know the teenagers start acting like, oh, no, here we go again, but still to be able to have those stories. What made me appreciate the importance of legacies was when I was working with people who were adopted, especially the adults who were adopted. One of the feelings were that the legacies were never really theirs, that they never really felt a part of the family because they didn't inherit the history as a family member. So inheritance makes a difference. And the other fear was that at any point in time, someone could say to them, you don't really belong to this family. This really isn't your history. You don't have the right to be here because this isn't your family. So again, your children don't have to worry about anybody trying to take the legacies from them. The children don't have to worry about somebody saying that they don't deserve. They can feel motivated. They can feel attached by virtue of the fact that they are family. I think it's important that you know what you provide to the children and what needs you meet by being able to share those legacies. Your children need to know where they come from. So it's more than just storytelling. You're also responding to emotional needs of your children. which lead to their attachment to you. They need to know where they come from. So you need to provide not just a biological tree about their parents and about their family, who gave birth to who was whose aunt and uncle, but also a geographical migration of where the family came from. What countries did they come from? What oceans did they have to cross? What roads did they have to travel? How many miles did they have to travel to reach where they came from? And then what were the reasons for leaving? Was it education? Was it opportunity? Was it safety? What were the reasons for the migration? What were the reasons for moving? And then what were the social and family challenges at the time? Were there people, were they experiencing prejudice? Did they experience relationships? Were they experiencing discrimination? The Trail of Tears that Native Americans speak of and talk about, that's a very emotional story. Not only are you talking about challenges, but actual situations where they experience life-threatening challenges. So those kinds of histories are very passionate and need to be shared with the children. And then what were the strategies for overcoming the challenges? What did people have to do to get from point A to point B and be alive? What did people have to do in order to develop businesses and to own homes? What were the strategies? What were the opportunities? What were the outcomes? And those conversations that you have with the children sound like this. Do you know where you were born? You can start with simple things like that. Do you know where you lived when you were first born? Do you know where your parents met? How they met? Because children like to hear stories about themselves and about their parents. And again, it becomes very difficult if they're in adoption or if they're in foster care, but you know the stories. You have the access. You have the linkages. Children need to know who I am, who I'm like, what can I be? And talking about who and what were the talents and the skills and what were the achievements in families are crucial in terms of being able to meet those needs. Because you're now giving the children an idea of who they can become, of what their talents are. And those conversations sound like, do you know who owned businesses in our families? Do you know what talents your mom had when she was your age? Do you know from whom you get those talents regarding the smile or the look or their athleticism? So you go back to family and you talk about the history. And you need to talk about culture. Culture is important because you need to talk to the kids about lifestyles and values. What are the values in this family and where do they come from? This is crucial. Rites of passage. Children need to know how to belong to families, how to join families, how to show loyalties, and how to be accepted in families. In this family, in order for you to be looked at as an adult, you have to be able to have a home, be able to care for yourself, have a job. In order to be respected as an adult in this family, you have to treat people with respect. In order to be respected as people in this family, you have to know how to talk to other people, how to carry yourself. In order for you to be respected as a parent, you have to be able to feed your children, clothe your children, and provide them shelter. When you graduate, these are things that we do to celebrate your graduation. And this is what we do when children are born into our families. So you talk about christenings and traditions. You talk about what things happen in your family when people reach certain developmental ages of puberty. And it varies by culture. These give children a sense of belonging, how they're going to be brought into the family, how to join the family, and what they have to do in order to remain in the family and to show that they deserve to be in families. So rites of passage is an important part of helping children be connected. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. If you have a family meeting with other relatives and you're talking about situations that are very serious, what makes you feel as though you have the right to be at that meeting? And just put it in the chat. What makes you feel as though you have a right to express your opinions in those meetings? Put it in the chat. What makes you feel as though you have a right to even disagree in those meetings? What makes you feel as though you deserve to be at those family meetings, have a right to express yourself, and even have a right to disagree? And Candy, I'm going to turn that over to you to share.
Okay, we're getting a couple of them coming in now. It says, I'm a member of the family.
Okay.
You are a part of the family and the future support. Simply because you are a family member. You have invested in the family.
I like that, invested.
And because you belong.
Because you belong. You have now just described the rights and entitlements that you have that foster and adoptive parents do not have in terms of inserting themselves into your family. And I'll repeat that. That's the strength of a caregiver. You've identified the rights and entitlements to make input, to make changes in the family, which foster parents and adoptive parents don't have. They have the right to influence the children that they're caring for, but they don't have any right to become and insert and make inputs into the family and how the family operates. Their rights stop there simply because they are not family. That's the power. That's the influence. That's the strength you have as a as a caregiver, and you need to use it. Because one of the problems I used to have and saw very often as a therapist was we would do all these great changes and we would do all this work with the children and we would help them develop new behaviors and new attitudes. But then when they went home, there was no one to reinforce it. There was no one there to model it for them. There was no one there to reinforce it. It takes a village to change patterns and cycles. One person, one child cannot do this. And as a caregiver, you've got that power to influence. You've got the right to be there. And you're doing more than just changing the child. You're changing the family so that the family can reinforce your work with the child. So to reinforce your work with the child, you need to get the family also on board in terms of what do we need to do to reinforce the changes, to reinforce the behaviors, to reinforce the new values that we're going to have in this family. But it starts with first looking at families' legacies. What legacies are you going to change and which ones are you going to repeat and which ones are you going to let go? If it's a legacy of drug use, of domestic violence, are you going to keep it? If it's a legacy of using weapons to solve conflicts, are you going to keep that one? Criminal involvement, lifestyles, incarceration, are you going to keep that one? Are you going to keep the legacy of having unplanned pregnancies? Of having unplanned children? In terms of the males in the family? What about literacy in reading and writing and computer science? Are you going to create new academic goals for your children? What's the professional developments that you're going to develop? What about wealth management, owning property, teaching folks how to save instead of living for the weekend? What are we going to do about that? Because it's selecting and using the legacies that you're going to keep. You first have to know what you're going to keep and what you're going to let go. And the approaches start with conversations with other family members. This house is going to be drug-free. You're talking about new goals now. I know this might be a surprise for everyone and even seem unfair. I know addiction is hard, but we're going to overcome. We will help find services and stick together as a family as we have in the past. It's saying as we have in the past that says, folks, we've done this before. We're talking about your resilience as a family to overcome. And you go back to those things. But first you have to talk about what you're going to change, what you're not going to accept anymore. And if you don't know what to talk about, go back to talking about what were the needs, the unmet needs that resulted in the children coming into care. How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? So you don't have to just grab things out of the sky. You can start real concrete. I don't want this to happen again. We need to make sure that our children don't go in the system. We need to make sure that what led up to this child coming into my care won't happen again. That's your right. Someone talked about right and privileges and responsibilities and commitment and investment. I love that word that somebody said, investment. When you invest this time in caring for the children, you're invested, and that investment gives you the right to say, hey, look, I've made these changes. She's talking about going back home to you, my son, my daughter, to her parent. What do we need to do to make sure that my investment has a return and that these children will not regress? So your investment, keyword, gives you the right to have these conversations. And the conversations start with, what do we need to do in order to make sure that these children don't come back into care? What do we need to do to make sure that the needs are met so that the children can remain with parents in our families? Because this is, especially if there's been a pattern of parents, of children not staying with parents because of incarceration, that there's a pattern of children not staying with parents because of drug use. So you look for the parents, and that becomes the topic of conversation around what goals are we going to change in our family. And then refer to your family identity. Talk about who you come from. The reason why that conversation is so important is because that conversation leads into the conversation of because we deserve better. That's why the conversation is about the past and the families and the accomplishments. We deserve better. We're better than this because we come from. That's the first part of this conversation. We deserve better. We are better. And how about this one? We know better now. Maybe we didn't know better before. And this, I've seen some relative caregivers use this as an opportunity to apologize to their children for not giving them better. Because they're able to say, and you may have to admit, I didn't know better, or I didn't do better then. But I do know better now. I can do better now. And your children deserve better now. That leads into these conversations about making the changes, because now you're explaining why. But it does start with sometimes admitting what you didn't do so that you now know what you will need to do. That's the strength of kinship care. You're better the second time around. Then we got to talk about changing those rites of passage. To be a member of this family, you can't use drugs anymore. Look at this conversation. I literally took this conversation from a family